Welcome to Ideas of India, where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Today, my guest is Lant Pritchett, and he's the Research Director of the RISE program affiliated with Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government, the Research Director at LAMP, and a Fellow at the London School of Economics. We talked about his research on labour migration and its benefits, NIMBYism, a global prosperity line to replace the $1-a-day poverty line, his reading habits, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. So, Lant, thank you for coming back on the show. One of the reasons we're having you back is because we couldn't get through all the papers that you have written last time, especially some of my favorites. And one of my favorite papers by you is one that you've co-authored with Michael Clemens and Claudia Montenegro. It's called The Place Premium. And what is a good way of thinking about the place premium within a country? Because what you really look at is barriers to movement across international borders. And you find that this is one of the largest remaining price distortions in any global market. In fact, from some places like Nigeria, you can have up to an 8x difference in wage premium. If you think about a country like India, which is fairly large in size, India has effectively had open borders, for the entirety of its history. In the last census that was conducted in 2011, about 50 million economic migrants were counted. I think that's an underestimate, but it's still useful. In the 2017 economic survey, they placed it at about 100 million. Now, if you think about India, and you're very familiar, there are places like Bihar, which are at the sort of GDP per capita level of a country like Haiti. And then there are places like Goa, which are at the GDP per capita levels of Jordan. Why do so few people move around, even within the borders of India, where clearly these kinds of international barriers don't exist, but there is a wage premium to be had?
So I think there's a couple of solid things and a couple of conjectures. One is people much prefer to live where they were born, around people they grew up with, around their family. So even in equilibrium, we would expect a pretty substantial wage premium. So when, particularly across a place like India, that's culturally heterogeneous, right, in the sense that the culture of Bihar is not the culture of Goa, is not the culture of Kerala, is not the culture of Tamil Nadu. I think of India like I think of Europe. It's at least as culturally heterogeneous across India as it is across Europe. I think even if you think of India as being, having a common Hindu religion, by living in Tamil Nadu for a year, I learned it's not exactly the same Hinduism in a lot of ways. So first of all, I think there's bias. And when we tried to look at culturally different but legally integrated markets, you get wage premium differences of identical individuals as large as 50% in apparent equilibrium. So you should expect some pretty, large equilibrium. Second, to get from the comparison you're talking about of GDP and average incomes, the whole point of the place premium was to essentially, if you think of a wage surface or a wage function that relates wages to individual characteristics, you need to drill down to identical productivity individuals. So to some extent, areas like Bihar are lagging in part because they have underinvested chronically in education, and places like Kerala are in part rich because they have invested in education. So, a large part of the difference in average incomes is differences in the characteristics. So, you'd have to drill down into do the econometric exercise of, like we do, of estimate the wage function in the two places and then equivalent the individuals, and that's going to account for some. That's, I think, pretty solid. The conjecture I had, and this is part from research I did together with Chandrabrad Prasad, who, as you may know, is a very flamboyant Dalit activist who I enjoyed very much. I actually went out with him while I was doing the research to visit his house in Uttar Pradesh. The second thing is that I don't think land markets in India work very well, if at all, in two senses. One, and I think Mark Rosenzweig a long time ago had a paper like this, the heterogeneity in land is very high in hard to observe ways. So, people own given parcels, and the parcels depending on really, really specifics. And so I think people are reluctant to sell their land. Second, I do think given the weakness of the legal environment in India, I think they feel they need to stay on their land to protect their claim to it. So I think there's a lot of partial migration to where somebody needs to stay on this plot that this family owns, because if we leave for a year or 2 years, we can't really expect that someone won't essentially expropriate it from us. So I think when we looked at, for instance, Dalit migration, there was a lot more migration among Dalits than among the landowning castes. So in some sense, Janis Joplin has an old rock song, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. And I think a lot of people in India in the rural areas have something to lose, and hence it freezes them in place because they can't get a good return out of it and take the lump sum and move to the city. And they can't, as a family unit, as a census counted unit, move to the city without risk losing their property. Somebody has to stay at home. So I think you get a lot of fractional migration, meaning parts of the household move. My conjecture is the census radically undercounts that. When I was living in India in 2005 or so, there was a prominent Indian sociologist who was basically saying, look, if you go into villages in India, there's nobody there. So the census might be undercounting migration by a factor of 2. And if you had 200 million people in India that had moved out of a population of 1.3, that seems consistent with the true gains to mobility. But they would be moving on a rotational basis because they wouldn't give up, in some sense, their claim to the family household, the family plot. But it does mean, I think, that this leads to a whole different set of conjectures about India's response to the changes since, say, the liberalization in 91. Because I think the people who bet on staying in the rural areas made a big mistake. And so a lot of the divergence and inequality within India is the result of people, who owned a little bit of land and thought, well, I can't give that up to move to the city. And then, just owning a little bit of land in rural India did not turn out to be a great long-term bet.
I agree with you on the land markets. Actually, it's much worse than what you described. There are a lot of restrictions on the sale of land. And some of this goes back to, sort of like colonial fears of people who will have to sell their land in a fire sale when there's a drought. So actually, there are lots of rules about how farmers cannot sell their land to non-farmers or to rich farmers. There's also all kinds of, land ceiling laws which prevent a family from owning more than, X hectares of land. In most states, that number is like, high single digits or in the teens. So you can't quite have a rich family or a rich firm just buying up swaths of land and freeing these rural farmers who would have otherwise been urban migrants, right? So I think your land point is well taken.
Yeah. I mean, in particular, they would have been household migrants, meaning as opposed to individual migrants. So with Chandrabal Prasad, we did a survey just of Dalits, a universal survey of districts. So all Dalits in a district, not a random sample. And 60% of the households had someone in the household in an urban area elsewhere in India. So I think the amount of fractional, I don't know what to call it exactly, but, partial migration is very much higher. And then those don't necessarily get counted by the census because it's what's your usual residence. Well, anyway, but I'm 100% confident that you know more about the land market restrictions than I do. I think it's very hard to get fair price. I mean, it's hard to sell it at all. Hard to get what you feel is fair price, hard to then take that lump sum and make a big bet on. And it's also hard to acquire urban land. Move to a city, the land markets in cities don't work that well either. So let's pull up our stakes, sell our stake in the rural area, move to the urban areas, is made really complicated by existing markets and regulations on those markets.
So it seems to me like you're saying that whatever premium there may have been has been exhausted, given all these various frictions in land markets and, housing costs in urban areas and sort of informal sector transaction costs and things like that. So whatever premium there exists is now gone, and we have the equilibrium number of people who would migrate given the regulatory circumstances. Is that a fair way of thinking about what you're saying? I
think that's a fair way of thinking about it. I mean, a lot of the research I do is around migration. And with migration, it's just coercion. Like, if you try and move from India to the United States, someone with a hat and a gun and a badge stops you at the border, or tries to, asks for your appropriate documents, and will physically turn you back and send you back if you don't have that. So the premiums that can exist in international markets, we would expect them to be huge because we actually see the process whereby these premiums are being maintained of highly restrictive, coercive restriction on moving across borders, whereas within regions, there's frictions in the labor market, friction in the land market. I would guess India is pretty near equilibria, and there aren't these huge gains to releasing Biharis to go work in Tamil Nadu. That said, there are huge flows. When I lived in Chennai, I was there as a trailing spouse, and my wife was working at the American school, and they were building new buildings at the American School of Chennai. And a big question was, what language was the job site language? Because basically nobody on the job site spoke the local language.
Tamil.
Nobody spoke Tamil. So Tamil wasn't really even an option. It was between Hindi, because many of the construction managers were from the north, the language of Orissa, where most of the workers were. And it was a big safety issue, right? Because imagine being on a job site where there's 4 or 5 mutually unintelligible languages. So there is massive migration going on, but I don't think it's in huge disequilibrium is my gut take. Other than disequilibria that are sustained by both regulatory and, market failures, in the sense that the market really doesn't work well.
Now, I want to bring you to the United States, which is another, huge sort of subcontinent with open borders internally, right? And in this case, there is far less heterogeneity. So, I know Massachusetts is very different from Arkansas, but is it, on matters of language and other things, it's also far less transaction costs involved in something like selling a house in Massachusetts, buying in Arkansas, or the other way around. And yet, in the United States, the mobility, especially among millennials generation and the one after me, has been declining compared to previous generations. So once again, has any kind of premium from movement been completely exhausted, or are there other reasons why people don't move anymore?
I really don't have anything useful to say on this. I live in the United States, born and raised there, but I haven't read up on this literature enough to really know. It hasn't been true of my family. My family, every generation has moved across states for 5 generations. So my children don't live where I grew up. I didn't grow up where my father grew up. My father didn't grow up where his father grew up. His father didn't grow up where his father didn't grow up. So we've been part of the mobility. And I understand that there's research showing it's gone way down, but I don't understand it and why it is. The only thing I've read on this that I find very interesting is Ed Glazer has a really interesting paper about, suppose you're not in the labor market and you're living on transfers of some kind, then your main incentive is not to move to a high productivity environment, but to stay in a super cheap environment. So I think a lot of the really depressed areas in America, if you're dealing with people whose labor market prospects are relatively low because they're disabled in one way or another or on disability, and they're living in one way or another off transfers, then the incentive is to stay in these really depressed places because, housing's super cheap, and, not move to a high productivity area because high productivity areas are naturally associated with high land prices. So, the United States really does have some embarrassingly depressed regions of the country where economic prospects have declined, and yet I think people are rationally not moving away from them, in part because they might be trapped by housing prices, which, if your only asset is your house and housing prices are depressed in your area. But second, they might be making optimal choices to respond to, if I've got a fixed income transfer, then I want to minimize living costs.
I think another might be, the economic homogeneity that's set in post-globalization, in the sense that a lot of the industry clusters moved out of the United States, and people tend to move to clusters, right? And there's a particular kind of skill which is associated with the wage premium in that particular cluster. And now we have very few clusters like that remaining in the United States. So Silicon Valley is an obvious example. Of course, that's not an industrial hub. It's more a tech hub. And even that benefit might be dissipating post the pandemic and work from home and so on. But I wonder if that has something to do with it, a kind of economic homogeneity that's set in since firms moved to China and so on.
That sounds like a plausible and interesting conjecture, but like I say, I don't have any special insight on this.
Going back to sort of open borders globally, one of the things that your paper shows is that one is the gaps are just extraordinary, what you find after you measure them, right? And of course, they're different depending on the origin country and the skills of the individual, in question. And you control for all of that. But one of the main sort of takeaways from the paper is allowing greater movement of labor can, in some sense, be one of the greatest, anti-poverty programs that ever existed. Now, let's say we're in an ideal world and we do allow for completely open borders or more open borders than what we have right now. Are you worried about the level of NIMBYism that already exists is going to set off all the gains that we get from open borders?
So, I have lots of friends like Ryan Kaplan and others who talk about open borders. I never talk about open borders. I talk about greater labor mobility. And the reason I talk about greater labor mobility is I think a big tension facing the world is that the rich societies are just aging in really extraordinary terms. And so people talk about low population growth, but low population growth isn't the issue. The issue is the inversion of the demographic pyramid. And the inversion of the demographic pyramid is creating societies that just have way too few workers relative to the number of retirement aged. And it gets worse and worse inevitably over the next 30 years. So the difficulty is that most of the way that the regime for mobility of persons around the world has worked since the 1920s is that people who are allowed to work in a country are either citizens or on a path to citizenship in the country. I'm actually a big advocate of separating those two things and saying, look, the needs of the US or Germany or France for labor are not being met because if the only way in which a person can come and work in France to take care of the elderly or perform, relatively low skill services is by allowing that person to become a French citizen, the kind of political consensus is no. Would prefer not having the service. I don't know if you remember that scene from The Matrix where Neo encounters the architect and he says, look, we'll wipe humans out. And Neo says, well, if you wipe humans out, then you won't have all the service you get from these humans. And the architect says, there's levels that we're willing to go. I feel like increasingly the rich world is saying there are sacrifices we're willing to make if our only choice for having people work in our country is putting them on path to citizenship, which, given the magnitudes of the flows, is inevitably going to change everything about the society and the politics and everything else. And so, people like Paul Collier, right, saying, look, people just want to preserve this sense of national identity. And hence, if you force them to choose between preserving national identity and meeting the labor needs that exist, they'll make hard choices in favor of national identity, which I think is where we are. So my big thing is if we actually had rotational mobility in which people could come and perform the labor services, but not necessarily instantaneously be on path to citizenship, this could be a big thing that would be win-win-win. It would be win for the countries that need the labor. It would be win for the workers that move. It would be win for the sending countries. And so I think, like I say, open borders implies that these concerns of national identity are going to go away or be weak. And I don't look at any rich country and see those concerns getting weaker. The fact that twice in a row, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name right because I don't do French, but Marine Le Pen has been the presidential candidate in the runoff twice in a row, and she's gone from 34% to 42%. Doesn't sound like the world's getting more friendly to open borders. That said, the needs for this labor are going to get so huge, in my view, that there needs to be some intermediate solution. And I think a well-regulated industry that does rotational mobility is a massive, massive opportunity. I just wrote a paper that I think I made everybody angry because I pointed out the gains from rotational mobility are bigger than the losses from climate change.
Let me focus just on the gains from rotational mobility. Now, just the way you said there's open borders, which is different from, increase in labor mobility. So, one kind of NIMBYism is the political NIMBYism that you're talking about. We don't want people to get citizenship and so on. The other kind of NIMBYism is just we're not going to let people build homes and we're not going to allow people who are working in these communities to live in these communities. Is that kind of local level NIMBYism going to wipe out the gains from labor mobility if it continues? Because look at San Francisco. The whole thing is bananas.
Yeah, I mean, I agree we can stipulate that San Francisco is bananas. But I think San Francisco is a super special case, I feel, because I think lots of places in America, it's get immigrants or die. Places with meatpacking industries, places with agriculture. A large part of the political tension in the United States is the fact that there are just chronically declining places and chronically booming places. I think you're seeing NIMBYism in places that have had pressures for growth for a very long time, like the Bay Area and Silicon Valley and San Francisco. Whereas I did a paper kind of about mobility and geographic mobility over time. There are large swaths of the Midwest. I think the data I was using at the time was 1930 to 1990, over the 60-year period. Well, the population was a third as large as it would have been had you had the rate of natural increase. So there's been massive outmigration from rural areas of large swaths of America for a very long time. I don't see Cleveland or Toledo or Mississippi or a lot of these places having super strong NIMBYism pressures. If you could reassure people that these people are going to come and work and they're going to be part of the local economy, but we're not pre-committing from the minute they arrive that they're on path to citizenship. And again, I'm not saying every rotational mobility doesn't have some path to citizenship, but it's not immediate and automatic. So I think a lot of regions, their big problem is, if you think, the way urban and spatial agglomeration works is they're on the downside of spatial agglomeration economies. And I don't know what the opposite of NIMBYism is. YIMBYism?
YIMBYism, I believe.
YIMBYism. I think there's a lot of pressures among the declining areas for YIMBYism. I mean, just as a weird anecdote, right? One time my wife and I were driving across the country, which we like to do, and we happened to be driving through Nebraska at the time of the Nebraska State Fair. And it was amazing. Like, really, one of the truly amazing applications of science to a field is agriculture in the United States. I mean, it's unbelievable how scientific modern agriculture in the United States is. And yet, this is a dying lifestyle. The Nebraska State Fair, it's about agriculture as an industry. And you have this unbelievably rich land, unbelievably high productive agriculture, and you got nobody doing it. Sooner or later, Nebraska has to choose. Are we going to have the land occupied by people that are going to work it and sustain a potentially high productivity industry, or are we going to decline as they have been for, again, large swaths of Nebraska have less people there, absolutely, than they had 100 years ago. So particularly, by the way, if you could make rotational migration be region specific, I think that would change the political dynamics a ton. If you could give a person a visa to come work in the United States, but they could only work in designated YIMBY areas, then, of course, the whole national dynamic that everybody worries that all the migrants want to go to Silicon Valley or all the migrants want to go to New York could be addressed. It's just the difficulty is these discussions aren't even on the table. Nobody's even talking about all of the various ways in which very clever rotational labor mobility could be designed and used, and the win-win-win that could be produced if we had these legally enforced, industry-engaged mobility. I think, if we started to think hard about it, we could develop and design things that would slice through some of these political considerations. But we have to be open to the not all labor mobility is citizenship.
Yeah, I think actually Alex Naurasta has written about this, where he thinks that a lot of these visas should be issued at the state level, maybe even more local than that, right? Because that's really where they're trying to attract workers. But I want to go back to the declining fertility rates and sort of, aging populations, right? The global average fertility rate is just above replacement rate, I think 2.3. In India in particular, for most of my growing years, it was that, India is overpopulated. We need to tame the population, this whole narrative. And now India's population is at replacement rate almost. So developing countries were sort of super obsessed with overpopulation being the main cause of endemic poverty. And, various family planning programs were announced. Some of these were quite draconian, including forced sterilizations and things like that we saw in India for a brief period. But most of it is, going back to our previous conversation, sort of seeing like a state, right? Like we need to sort of contrive it in such a way that families have fewer kids. Now, going back to some of your previous work, there was a big discussion at one point in time. In large part, the feminist movement said that the fertility rates are not declining fast enough because of supply side problems in contraception and family planning methods and this sort of unmet need, right? And some of your work is, on the other hand, on women's preferences, more about their individual choice, which is much more locally rooted, cultural, their economic circumstances, and so on. So where are we in the world on this sort of demand side versus supply side debate on fertility issues? And second, is the entire point moot because it seems like economic development and lower poverty rates across the world seems to have solved that problem for us in a way. So all of this doesn't matter anymore. So where are we on this exactly?
I think part of what you said, isn't quite right, which is in this debate, if we go back, this is an example in which there was a huge key shift in mindset that was very dramatic, happened at an identifiable point. So in 1994, there was the Conference on International Population Development held in Cairo. And in the run-up to that, there were three really powerful groups, or there were two powerful groups and economists as one group. So economists were saying, me, for instance, and others were saying, look, it's just not that plausible that people are having kids they don't want because of lack of ability to control their fertility. And so I produced a paper that said, look, if we look at reasonable measures of how many children women want to have, and then that explains nearly all the actual observed variation in fertility. And there's no evidence that conditional on women's fertility desires, the availability or lack of contraception plays a huge role. It plays some role, but relatively minor and modest relative to the population bomb needs. And so the interesting thing is that split the feminists versus the demographers. So there were demographers who were the population bomb types who said, the reason we need to limit fertility in order to limit population growth because McNamara...
They were Malthusian.
They were Malthusian. And it was a popular view among, McNamara, when he was head of the World Bank, said, the greatest threat to the humankind besides the atomic bomb is the population bomb. But the demographers were perfectly willing, or at least turn a blind eye to the coercion of women to achieve what they required as the needed fertility. So they had fertility targets in their mind for social, larger reasons. And they wanted to say if we just provided women with contraception voluntarily, it would dramatically reduce fertility because it meant their demographically driven family planning programs could be perceived and projected as non-coercive. And at the 94 conference, it was the feminists that said, no. We've had it with this demographic stuff. We want a reproductive health approach that says women should have access to contraception because women should have access to contraception, not driven by this exogenous need to reduce fertility. And so I think this was an interesting thing where the coalition between, in some sense, the liberal economist view that people should have choices, and when they make choices, they're going to maximize their utility, and the feminist view aligned, and the feminists just wiped the demographers out in 94 at Cairo, completely shifting the rhetoric around family planning from family planning programs as population-driven to family planning programs as an integrated part of reproductive health. And in a way that was, this is a case where economists were kind of right on the substance and right on what's good for human freedom is actually going to be okay. And we don't need all this coercive top-down regulation of women's fertility because if conditions get better, there's a transformation in, how many children couples and women and men want to have. And that put us on a path that turns out it's not been so terrible. So anyway, so it's really interesting story, though, because here the demographers were part of the seeing like a state view. And I think for a while, the feminists went along with them. But it was ultimately the feminists who revolted against the coercive and draconian population target driven family planning programs in favor of more choice for women about their own fertility and completely transform the field.
So now is all of this moot given where fertility rates are today? So that's one part of the question. And the other part is now do we need a new target to increase fertility rates? Because the fertility rates have dropped so much in so many parts of the world.
Hey, I do think it is mostly moot in the sense that, as you say, fertility rates are still quite high in some areas of Africa. But again, there's no sense in which Africa were to continue to have a kind of development path, it wouldn't also therefore be on this declining trajectory. Now, that said, I'm just as nervous about targets on the other side as I am about targets the other. I mean, no way we want, women coerced to have babies, just as we didn't want women coerced to not have babies.
That's not what I meant by targets, but yes.
No. Yeah. And then if you think, demographers, first of all, never had a model of human behavior, right? In the sense that the demographers always had the problem that if you did long-run projections, fertility had to go to replacement level or population went to zero or infinity. So they always we don't need a model of why people have 2.1. They just have to because otherwise our models are unstable, which is not a very good, position to be in. But I don't know that we as economists have a particularly strong handle on why fertility has fallen so very low. I have a paper called Why Demographic Suicide, in which I point out that an original economic innovation around Gary Becker and the theory of the family was, well, these reducing fertility in spite of children being a normal good is, quality quantity shifts. But now if you look at European fertility, there's a very large spike of women finishing their reproductive years on zero. And just analytically, quality adjusted zero is zero. So we can't explain, if our theory were right, that most of the shift or all of the shift was a quality quantity shift, we should have seen huge stack of fertility rates on one, right? Because one, there's integer constraints. And so, we should have seen a lot of super high quality only children. But instead, we've seen a lot more, I think, voluntarily choosing no fertility, zero children in your lifetime. That's not a choice that we can explain in quality training. So I think there are some new papers recently trying to get at why is fertility going so low, and do we have a good handle on why, faced with hugely prosperous and productive economies, men and women, but especially the locus of control is a lot of women now are choosing to have so few and including zero children.
Well, you were talking about economists having a model of behavior, right? So, not to make this too simple, but if through technology and immigration and cheaper labor and additional help, you can actually make it cheaper on the margin to have more children and raise more children, you could possibly move the needle on that. So in a sense, your previous work on labor mobility might be more connected to the fertility issue than just simply about aging populations.
That's a good point. I think we might be headed there with our considerations of if it were the case that allowing rotational migration to handle both end of care too, because, the sandwich generation is caring for the elderly and for children. And so given that double burden, you often, will choose to not have as many children. Whereas, there's no reason why the rich world couldn't have just radically more support to the care industry than it has from, controlled and regulated labor mobility.
Yeah. Fertility is quite tightly linked to poverty and economic well-being. So even now, the world is very much on the trend of the places that are poorer are having, more children. That is higher than replacement rate versus lower. So it's also weird in a global inequality sense that this is sort of disproportionately shared by poorer countries, which always have, fewer capabilities. So this is, again, more and more reasons to have greater mobility than not, because if the survival of the richer countries depends on this, they've got to make it easier to have and sustain higher than replacement rates fertility. There's a lot of conjecture on whether poverty rates have reduced since the Modi government took office, whether they have increased since Modi government took office. And of course, all of this is hugely dependent on how we measure, estimate this, and which data source we use. So, there's a recent IMF paper that released that, India has eradicated extreme poverty by 2019. Similarly, there's a new World Bank paper that says that, these estimates are higher than previously imagined at about 10.2%, something like that. But there's still a big debate on this. But my question is, all of these are measuring around the, $1.9 a day poverty line. Right? So I have a slightly different question. So given that a lot of this is about measurement and about estimation and how some of this can even be rigged by, local and national governments because they want to look better or worse in global rankings, should we just eliminate this problem and have a single global poverty line? And here, what I mean by a single global poverty line is not that the $1.9 in India is the same everywhere, but rather that whatever works for Denmark or whatever works for the United States also works for India and also works for Sudan. So if the global poverty rate is, as say, the US line of $15 a day, then that is the line. I know you're chuckling, but you've kind of suggested this in a slightly different way. My reason for suggesting this is more simply it can't be rigged by national governments and they just simply have to aim higher. Right? It can't just be I gave someone a little bit, extra rations and some extra transfers and I pushed them further up or further down the line. Right? So that's sort of my very public choice motivations for this. What do you think of this idea, and is this a good way to go globally?
As you might know, I had a paper, I think, from 2006 called Who is Not Poor that made exactly the proposal. And again, I think there are two ways to think about this. One is made exactly the proposal of let's just have a global standard for poverty. And it's hard to come up with a justification for why, if you happen to be born in the United States or Germany, there's one standard of what it means to be poor. And if you happen to be born in Bangladesh, you're not entitled or you shouldn't have any expectation of having that. You should live by this other poverty line. So I think my preferred kind of solution to this would be to let's have a measure called global prosperity, and a measure of poverty is you're poor if you're not in prosperity. And that would be at least something like $15 a day, maybe $20 a day, which would still lower than, by the way, European poverty lines, but just a kind of single global poverty line, and call that the high poverty line. And if you think about type 1 and type 2 air, you're pretty convinced that someone who's above that line is not in dire poverty. The other, we could continue to have this low bar poverty line, but I find the low bar poverty line just theoretically, pragmatically, and morally obscene. I've been against the $1 a day poverty line since it was invented. I fought very hard against it when it was introduced in the WDR, the World Development Report 1990. Matter of fact, I complained to the head of the WDR that this was just going to focus people on this absurdly low standard. And his response was, oh, Lant, you're overthinking this. We just need some aggregate number of poverty. But of course, this poverty line is too low for anybody to really take it seriously. Well, it turns out I wasn't overthinking it. And people all of a sudden really did take this line way too seriously. But that said, I think we could say, look, we're going to measure super low bar poverty, where each country is going to have its own national poverty line. And then we're going to measure high poverty. And we're going to report all three all the time. So like you said, the high bar poverty essentially becomes national income, average consumption measure, because nearly everybody in India is poor by a high bar poverty line, even today. And that's a prosperity goal that I think we could kind of get on board with. I could go on and on about the low bar poverty line. Is just terrible, terrible, terrible thing.
But tell me why it's terrible. Tell me all the arguments against the low bar poverty line. Like for me, it is that it's aiming too low and that it can be rigged. Those are my, fundamental problems with it. What are some of the other problems?
Well, my fundamental problem is it's claiming there's this objective function where the derivative of that objective function with respect to income gains goes to exactly zero above the poverty line. Now, you could say, well, marginal utility of income is well approximated by a zero at some line, because above that, we're all into positional consumption and Veblen-esque kind of excess, positional consumption. And so we could say that there is a line above which marginal utility of income is so low that it's well approximated by zero. And Angus Deaton has the famous line, he's in favor of poverty lines as long as it's infinity, right? We could have a high poverty line. But the thing is to imagine that marginal utility income is exactly zero at $1.95 today is just morally obscene. People at that level of income have dire material shortages in nearly every dimension of their lives. And to act as if additional income to those people isn't enormously important and valuable, it's just obscene. It's obscene. And I don't know how the world has gotten away with pretending we care a lot about the poor, but at the same time creating this completely paternalistic, completely unrealistic thing and saying, oh, by the way, if you're at $2 a day, well, what the hell? Marginal utility is income for you. We don't have a goal for reducing that. So I think that's my main objection, is that $1.90 per day is not a level at which marginal utility of income is well approximated by zero just above that, right? And so it puts us into just stupid economics. Like, there is no line. Why would we think that? One way I've put this is, if we take $1.90 of the poverty line, nobody has ever held a $1.95 a day party. Who's ever, holy smoly, I'm at $1.95 a day with my latest raise. They're like, oh, let's have a big old party and I'm out of poverty. It's just absurd. And imagine market utility of income really were well approximated by zero at $1.95 a day. Then why the hell people are working 45 hours a week at really demanding and dangerous and dirty occupations at those income levels? Why are people scrambling around to continue to improve their material circumstances at those levels? And so that we have this paternalistic superimposition of a poverty line, the consequence of necessarily is that you treat increments to income above that line at zero with respect to its objective function as an objective of development. I think it was just a stupid, evil mistake from the get-go. It's time to get rid of it.
I think there's also, other concerns. I think it also changes how governments and development economists and policy people think about this. What I like about the $20 line, poverty or prosperity line, is you cannot redistribute your way out of it. There is no option except economic growth. Whereas at the $1.90 line, you can make some minor adjustments and redistribute and give some transfers and rations and sort of, manipulate that whichever way you want. But I think it also changes how policymakers think about the problem. There's a question of aiming high versus aiming low, and maybe increasing that line globally will bring the conversation back to growth and convergence.
Absolutely. But again, I don't think it was ever the South politicians who were driving a focus on low bar poverty. This was always a development global North agenda, not a global South agenda. It was
but they've taken it and they've run with it, right? Like it's one of those things where if this is the metric, they'll game it.
Yeah. No. You create a metric and you game it. But I think if we want to have a real development economics going forward, it has to be a South-based, South-driven economics. And you go back to the vision of the first generation post-colonial leaders like Nehru and Nkrumah. And, they didn't have a vision of India as a slightly less poor place. They had a vision of India as being a global player at the global table with an equality of nations and fully prosperous. They wanted everything that the UK and the US had, and they still do. And the weird thing is that we've been able to convince South politicians to take this on and start gaming it with programs that are aimed at poverty reduction when, again, there is no line. Like, people aren't radically happy because the analytical mistakes we get into, because we get into the mistake of like, oh, we have a poverty program. Great. And we're trying to target the poor. Great. But therefore, stuff that doesn't go to the poor is leakage. Well, that's just stupid because the marginal utility of a person just above the poverty line is exactly the same as the marginal utility of a person just below the poverty line. And yet the way we calculate leakage in poverty programs, it assumes that, if a unit of transfer goes to somebody at $1.95 a day, it's not benefiting poverty. And when it goes to somebody at $1.85 a day, it is benefiting poverty. That's just crazy stupid. The marginal utility of those two individuals is exactly the same. And it creates all kinds of crazy politics and crazy obsession with how do we correctly target that aren't good politics. They're not good economics. They're not good anything. It's just wrong.
I think we agree.
Yeah.
One question I had here, when you say we, in terms of fighting world poverty, who is the we? Is it the poor? Is it the government? Is it development economists? Is it the World Bank? I ask because I think it's important to clarify what are the incentives at play here, right? When we say we, as in you and me, our motivation and incentives quite different than, say, the governments of the global south or, the paternalism of the global north, whether it comes from the bank or some other institutions. So who is fighting world poverty at the moment? Like, who is the we that we keep referring to?
Yeah, I have to say, having worked in and around the World Bank for 20 years, I sometimes by we, frankly, just mean the World Bank and people, my colleagues and people there. And there is something called the development community, right? And that has a kind of an academic branch, people who are in universities and think tanks and claim development or development economics is their field. And then there are donor institutions that do development. So often when I say we, I have the development community in mind. And I have a paper called Can Rich Countries Be Reliable Partners for National Development? That sort of goes to the fact that it used to be, I feel, that the development community was more aligned with the needs, wants, and wishes of the South and has diverged. I think the global North has adopted poverty because it's terrible economics, not in spite of its being terrible economics, because if you think what the poverty analysis says, if the poverty rate's 40%, it claims that the marginal utility of the median person in a developing country and the marginal utility of a median person in a rich country are the same because they're both zero. Well, that's stupid. That's just wrong, right? The marginal utility of somebody at $2 a day and somebody at $30 a day are radically different. And yet poverty, low bar poverty makes them look the same. And that way, the global North countries can go, oh, well, we don't want to give away money of our citizens to the rich because, the rich in these poor countries, they don't need it. And they act as if the median citizen of France and the median citizen of a country like India are the same level of income and there's no altruistic reason to make transfers. Well, that's just crazy stupid, right? But it's politically convenient because it gets you out from under kind of a true commitment to broad-based development, which I think the global north has been trying to do since the end of the Cold War. Sorry, I just want to say again, the frustrating thing is that poverty analysis survives because it's wrong in a way that's politically convenient for powerful interests in the north. It doesn't survive because it's right. It survives because it's wrong.
And it also doesn't survive because the people who are doing it are invariably rich. There's very little say of the people who are actually anywhere on this line or below or just above it in part of the discussion, right? On this, I have a question on whether there are players in the global south who can change the way we think of economic development. So, for instance, India has a fantastically influential diaspora across the world, right? I mean, especially, it's probably one of the largest country partners for even an institution like the World Bank. Is there room for specific countries like India to use their influence to change how we think about development economics? Or do you think now the global south is completely compromised, right? The Indian government benefits as much from this kind of, low bar poverty measure as the north does?
I don't think so. I think the governments of the big countries, after all, and now it's gotten really tricky, but when China went and started creating new development institutions, I think there was a lot of enthusiasm among the leadership in India and Indonesia and other global south countries that are out of the kind of low bar poverty levels, to create these new development institutions who are actually responsive to the needs of the South. So I do think that South-based, South-living economists and think tanks can play a big role in trying to push back and just say, look, this isn't our agenda. And, the Indian government isn't really reliant in any significant way. It's more cosmetic to them than existential that they be seen well by the rest of the world and the donors. I mean, it's not a big deal for them. I think there will be a time will come soon in which the mainstream development institutions will be taken over by the agenda of the global south, or they'll continue to die as they've been dying.
They kind of lost their purpose.
Yeah, exactly. And
they
lost their purpose because they lost their way. I mean, in the sense that they lost their purpose, and once they lost their purpose, so all kinds of countries like the UK have, absorbed their formerly independent development organizations into their broader DFID, became part of the Foreign Commonwealth, and now it's the FCDO. But it was because one kind of observation is that Australia, Canada, the UK, the US, all of them over time have seen their development organizations essentially disappear into the broader kind of diplomatic trade organizations. I have never once heard of any developing country complain about that.
That tells us something.
That's kind of embarrassing, isn't it? That
it is.
You're this development organization that supposedly you're out there helping all these countries, and yet when the domestic politics turn against you, the leaders of the country aren't calling the prime minister of the UK saying, oh, God, no, don't do that. It would be terrible. So I think, and in part, that's because they lost their purpose, and they lost the purpose of really being continued as seen as, truly valuable to the development purposes of the South population and South leadership.
So speaking of having lost our way in development, right, I want to talk once again about RCTs. We talked about this a little bit last time, and it was mostly about who really benefits from them. And I think you were right that, it's really philanthropists and donors who ought to insist upon RCTs and impact evaluations and so on. And a little bit upon the external validity issues. But you've written a lot more on what are the problems with RCTs. So that, the reason I want to have a detailed conversation with you on what is the Pritchett critique of RCTs, and feel free to take your time and develop it, is every time I'm back in India, the number one conversation amongst young people, either at university or about to start their master's or graduate work, is that what's really happening in India is RCTs. So that must be what's going on, and that must be the way to go. So if there is another way, Lant Pritchett, please show us the way.
So let's go back to what is sometimes called the Pritchett test, which is things that are really good for development or good for growth in particular. Let's just talk about economic growth because I think economic growth is linked and reliably linked to a whole bunch of good things. So let's talk about economic growth for a second. It ought to have four kind of basic facts about it. Rich countries should have more of it than poor countries. Something's really good for, level of income, then rich countries should have more than poor countries. Countries growing fast should have a lot more of it than countries growing slow. We should have a lot more of it in countries that are now rich than when those same countries were poor. And when you see substantial changes in it, we should tend to see accelerations. Those are the four kind of fundamental things. If I was looking for something that was really important for economic growth, I would expect Denmark to have more than Haiti. I would expect Korea to have more of it in 1965 than it had in 1961. I would expect Denmark to have way more of it now than they had in 1870. And I would expect Korea to have more of it than Ghana. Geez, if I'm saying this is important, none of those are true either about RCTs themselves, or are they true about any of the things on which the research method of RCTs is amenable? Because the things that are important for growth are important at an ontological level of the market. And at the ontological level, and I say ontological, the things for which RCTs are well adapted coming out of drug trials in medicine are things for which the treatment is individualizable. I can do it for you and not for me. But the things that lead to development are at the level of the market, at the level of the country, at the level of the society, at the level of the political structure, not things that are individual treatment. So first of all, no country that is developed is doing radically more RCTs than the developing countries. Denmark, Sweden, France, Japan. There's no movement to do RCTs in those countries, nor did doing RCTs play any significant role in the way they become rich and develop. So, just neither RCTs as a movement, nor the individual topics in which, if you look at the 3,000 RCTs being done, meet the Pritchett test at all. So my fundamental critique is we've moved into putting enormous amounts of effort into things that we know ex ante, by the simplest possible, does it make any logical sense, won't make a big difference to development. And again, I think we did that because we lost the purpose around broad-based prosperity and productivity in the first place and moved into this dollar a day kind of poverty. Then that allowed you to think in a programmatic way about pushing people just above or below this line. And I see RCTs as a symptom, not the disease, in the sense that they're an opportunistic infection. If you lose your immune system, you're going to get some nasty strains of diseases and then, they died of this disease. But you didn't die of that disease, you lost your immune system. So I see RCTs as an opportunistic infection in the body of the development community.
Why are they so popular if they have nothing to do with development? What is going on within the political economy of academia and the political economy of the development community that has made this the number one thing that everyone seems to work on? Because they're very smart people working on it. So it always makes me wonder why smart people devote their lives to something which you are so obviously pointing out is not going to get us the results that we want.
Because they're smart people. As we as economists believe, people maximize their self-interest, and smart people are going to be more effective at maximizing their self-interest than non-smart people. And that's why we have super smart people working on RCTs, because it creates an attributable product that in the academic world counts for a lot. Managed to create an environment in which methodologically this became, in some sense, for a variety of kind of history of economic and social scientific thought, it was easy to create a sort of environment in which that was kind of the easiest, most legitimate way to create an academic career for yourself. So why wouldn't we expect smart people to do what's in their best interest? And then we go back to my story is the loss of purpose, the fact that the development community was losing a commitment to broad-based development rather than gaining it, was interested in economizing and cutting back expenditures on development. So we had to be more targeted because we're going to devote less effort and less concern to the broad-based development issues. Led to an environment in which, therefore, you have this sharp targeting, programmatic, projectized kind of world in a competition for very much less resources. And that, therefore, then just from an academic point of view, just producing an individually reliable piece of empirical work, independent of it actually being important, became possible.
So on this, then I have a similar question on the rest of what's going on in the academy. Now, normally academics love to spot a weakness and go after it and prove other people wrong. If it is so obvious that RCTs have no value and they've lost their way, why are there so few critics of RCTs?
Well, because in part, you need the next big thing. Meaning, to some extent, RCTs came along at a period in which other previous methods like general equilibrium modeling and growth regression empirics were becoming kind of burnt over districts, and it was hard to get that. And I think part of the issue is if you go to a graduate student, so first of all, you shouldn't underestimate how much academic fields get driven by the need to produce new PhDs, right? An incredibly high fraction of all the research out there is produced at very early stages of academics' careers, including PhDs. So what a graduate student says is, tell me what to do such that you'll give me a PhD and I'll get a job, right? And RCTs provide a really wonderful answer to that, or at least have, right? And if I come in as a critic of RCTs, I don't come in with the next greatest thing. Like, I don't know, don't do an RCT, do this specific, concrete, wrap your head around methodologically straightforward thing, and I'll give you a PhD and get you a job. And so if I come along and go, no, we need to worry about growth diagnostics, and we need to worry about deals versus development, and we need to worry about things that Darono Samoglu and North and other, great thinkers of various stripes are worried about, I'm a grad student, I'm going like, no. I'm not going to hitch my fortune on becoming Darono Samoglu, right? It's like he's that, but I'm not that. I want to do something that I know for sure is going to produce a determinate outcome in a limited period that's going to produce something that people will call a dissertation. Boom, they'll stamp it and I'll go. Until we solve that problem, I think RCTs are here to stay, and independent of the critiques, because the critique that they're no use to people in the world, when have academics really ever cared a lot about that? So I think the difficulty is that they're infecting the development community from academia. And I think the development community is pushing back against it. But the problem in academia can't be solved unless we sort of say, no. You can't just do a silly little field experiment or pilot RCT of something that nobody's ever cared about in the first place. Let me attack a specific paper, which I've written a blog about that's in the public domain. But people did this RCT about whether if you build community schools in Afghanistan, enrollments rate will go up. Literally 11 villages in one region of Afghanistan. And what they found was if you build schools, kids are more likely to go to school. And their paper had literally 3 citations to the previous research. Now, the idea that if you build schools, kids are more likely to go to school has been the foundation of education policy around the world for 100 years. And so RCTs have created this weird, truly weird kind of mindset in which showing something with an RCT, even if everybody already knew and believed it, still was meritorious and new academic research.
Are RCTs sort of the backdoor solution to what became the identification mafia in the 2000s, right? This is basically the escape route, right? It's very, very...
No, this was the only... I don't ever actually think the critique was really ever well-founded in the following sense, right? It's like the game that got played in graduate seminars in economics is that I'm going to disbelieve what you say. So my prior, my Bayesian or otherwise prior, let's not even say that it's Bayesian, it's just a prior. I'm going to play this academic game in which my prior is that what you're claiming, that whatever you're talking about has zero impact. And then the dynamics of my prior are such that I'm not going to change my prior unless you present super gold standard evidence, right? But if you think about it, it's like, whoa. Where did your prior come from? The prior that was tightly centered on zero, that I would only be willing to move off to with powerfully, completely pure identification, wasn't a well-formulated prior based on the understanding of theory and evidence and the reality of the world. It was an arbitrarily chosen prior of zero. So having a prior based on an understanding accumulated of all kinds of reconciled evidence and then not being willing to move that prior without recognizing evidence, that's a reasonable way to be. But picking an arbitrary prior with no justification, Bayesian or otherwise, and then not moving off that prior unless you have perfect evidence. That's being an asshole. There's no scientific justification for arbitrarily choosing a prior and then being stubborn about changing your mind. Like, that's just being a goof. Like, oh, I've chosen to believe X and I won't stop believing X unless the burden on you is to prove that I'm wrong. It's like, no, X was just a goofy belief. So, the idea that you could say, oh, we're going to create the pretense. I call this feigned ignorance. We're going to pretend that no one really knows that if you build more schools, kids will go to school because there hasn't been rigorous evidence that. So I'm going to choose that my prior about the impact of building schools on enrollment is 0. And then I'll only move off that prior if you show me an RCT. Well, no. That wasn't ever a really scientifically coherent approach to the problem. And so the problem with the identification mafia was it wasn't that they wouldn't move their priors without rigorous evidence, that they were more and more, blah, blah, blah. It's like they never had any coherent rationale as how they were choosing the prior off which they had to be moved by rigorous evidence. And without that, they never really had a scientifically coherent set of claims or approach to a field in the first place.
The farce is almost worse than that because, okay, let me explain myself. It's not just that their prior was incoherent, right? That, we have no idea if building schools helps or not. Now they're saying that because we know that it helps in these 11 different villages or districts in Afghanistan, we know this as the fundamental truth everywhere. Whereas now there's a mountain of evidence that the external validity of these RCTs is actually pretty poor and it's highly contextually driven. And, all these arguments better than I do. So I think it's both. It's a particular kind of incoherence at the level of forming a prior, but it's also completely suspends all rational thought of being persuaded by the evidence everywhere universally because there's a very narrow result, which is the gold standard in measurement and attribution nevertheless, but it's still a very narrow result.
And let me just say, I'm going to say one more time, and there's this critique that I've been making for a long time that I can just never get people to really sort of wrap their head around, which is, suppose you had a prior distribution about, and I've written a paper called Let's Take the Con Out of Randomized Controlled Trials, building off the famous Let's Take the Con Out of Econometrics. They've pushed the con out of econometrics, but they've pushed it onto randomized controlled trials. So the problem is, let's say I have done 150 observational studies about the impact of building schools on child enrollment. That's going to have a distribution of the impact, with some places having high impact, some places having a median impact. There's going to be a distribution, right? Okay. So now I've got 150 studies. Here is the distribution of estimated impact from observational studies. Now you come along and in one context, you do an RCT. Now what that RCT should give you is it gives you two things. It gives you an estimate of the impact of building schools on enrollment, the kind of impact effect. But it also, if you do it right, and it's not that hard to do it right, gives you an estimate of the bias relative to the observational estimate. The problem is they don't yet to this day have a coherent answer to how do I move my prior about the overall distribution in response to these two new pieces of information from one specific context. Because the problem is, without loss of generality, you could either have a situation where the estimated impact effect is higher of the mean median of the existing observational studies. And so I should move my prior distribution up, meaning it has bigger impact. But at the same time, it could well be that the result of the estimate of the bias is that the bias of observational is negative. And so I should move my distribution down. So it isn't just an external validity problem. People keep acting as if the only thing produced by an RCT is the impact estimate. It also produces an estimate of the bias. And there's been no coherent answer to the question, should I move my prior of the existing observational studies towards the impact effect or towards the bias in the effect? And there's no guarantee that those turn out the same way, right? Second, there's never been any coherent argument as to why we should change our variance. So let's say we have a variance of our estimates, and in the paper I have variance of the estimates of the learning premium of being in a private school. So we take a kid, we observe their score, we observe what kids are in private schools, what public schools, and we say, what is the causal effect of a private school? That has a variance, right? okay, you come along and now you have a rigorous estimate of the causal impact of a kid being in private school in a given context. But then am I supposed to reduce the variance? Well, if I reduce the variance, it means I have to say some countries' context, my observational estimate was higher than that. I move lower. And some countries' contexts that were lower than that, I move higher. That makes no sense. It's just logically incoherent. And so, again, as science, the RCTs haven't met even the minimalist standard of having coherent answers to like pretty easy questions about methodology, about what am I to make of this new evidence you presented me with? And what people are saying about external validity is actually, once you did enough experiments, you just reproduce the variance of the distribution of the observational studies.
The thing about what do I make of the new evidence, right? To me, I think that's the most interesting question, not just on the bias and the variance, but also on what is being chosen as the experiment. Right? So if we look at some of these experiments with like mosquito nets, right? Malaria and mosquito nets, right? You would think that the solution to malaria is mosquito nets. Whereas the world over, we know that the solution to malaria is better, water and sanitation services, right? I have not seen mosquito nets in the rich and developed world. I have never used one myself because I've always lived in neighborhoods which are, relatively prosperous and don't have standing water and sewage and things like that. And yet, what is being measured, though I'm sure they are correct in measuring that if you gave away, free mosquito nets, or maybe for like a few cents you gave away mosquito nets, the malaria infections rates go down. It still, for me, doesn't solve the bigger development problem, because I've never heard a poor person saying, my main problem is I can't afford a mosquito net for my child. It's usually, I can't move my child out of this horrendous neighborhood where there are all kinds of infectious diseases. So I think that is my more fundamental problem. At the scientific level, it is what is being chosen for measurement. And I fully appreciate that it might be very difficult to do an RCT of, do we provide sewage services, or, are we going to have contaminated water in a particular area and endanger people? I understand that these things can't be easily studied in an RCT, but it still is relatively the more important question, right?
Absolutely. This is another good example of, look, you're biasing what's being looked at towards treatments that are individualizable away from systemic. America eradicated malaria. We got rid of it, even though it was endemic in the South for a long time. And so, like I say, we shouldn't be choosing policy levers to address a problem based on the fact that one of them is easier to generate rigorous evidence because we can solve the identification problem to the, standard of the identification perfection, which is really a good example of like, why are we looking at this versus that is a prior and important question to can I write a dissertation that, meets the needs of the seminar room about identification.
To move the question back to the non-biased question, right? So this is going back to a lot of the RCTs in India are on education. And education does seem to be one of the most important areas where investments need to be made and where both government and private philanthropy have a big role, right? But if we walked away from this attribution game, what have Vietnam and Peru done right that India got terribly wrong in education? And I pick these countries specifically, because we see that richer countries typically have better test scores and better outcomes, even if the models of schooling and education vastly differ both between countries and within countries and so on, right? But if you're richer, you tend to get better education, which is pretty straightforward. Now, Vietnam and Peru are not that much richer than India is, or at some point were not that long ago, were at the same sort of, income levels as the median Indian. And yet they have done something fantastically right when it comes to education in a way that India has gone horribly wrong. So what is going on in that story?
This is a good example where the right answer is not very attractive from an identification police kind of a point of view, which is, I'm head of this research project called RISE, and we had 7 country teams. One of the country teams was Vietnam. And the reason for choosing Vietnam was to answer this question: what did Vietnam do right? And after pushing our Vietnam team to say, what was the answer? Why did Vietnam do so well? in the end, one of our researchers who I have a lot of respect for, he said, look, it's just they wanted to. And they wanted to. And because they wanted to, they found a way to do it. So you're pressing for proximate determinant causes that aren't the ultimate causal driver of this. If you want to know why Vietnam has really high learning performance among the students, it's because they consistently, coherently wanted to. And if you don't want to, knowledge of, the type of this program versus that program, it's just not necessarily going to work as designed when you implement it, because it's not going to get implemented, or it's not going to be implemented as well. So we crudely sometimes joke that, the big answer from this long-term RISE project about what leads to higher learning achievement are the 3 A's, not the 3 R's, the 3 A's. And the 3 A's are, you gotta wanna. You gotta wanna. And if you don't wanna, and I think what India got wrong is India as a society, as a government, was never really, and still to this day, isn't truly committed to the belief that every child can and should achieve a relatively high level of learning performance. They were never really committed to it. Still aren't, there's still kind of the belief that education is a process of choosing the elite few who are good at it, and devil take the hindermost, even inside Indian classrooms today. So, and India, I think, is in the process of coming around to the you gotta wanna stage where there is generating a lot more social concern around this. But until India gets there, as we saw with, SSA was this massive, massive investment. During that whole period, as best the evidence can tell, overall learning per year of schooling of children was on a stagnant at best, but probably declining trend during that whole period.
So when you say you gotta want it, who are we talking about? Are we talking about parents? Are we talking about students, teachers, society at large, government, policymakers, economists?
I think everybody is the answer. Meaning you gotta wanna at the system, society level. Have these people talking about, we need to have a dissemination program where we reach ministers of education with the right messages. And it's like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, when have you ever met a powerful minister of education, right? They're completely responsive to pressures from the rest. So when you ask, I think the World Development Report, which was written by, friends of mine at the World Bank, 2018 on education, they said learning for all requires all for learning. And I think that's, again, a nice little phrase. When I say ya gotta wanna, ya is kind of everybody. You need to have parents on board. You need to have the education community, broadly speaking, on board. You got to have the government on board. And they have to be, have enough of a commitment to a clear set of coherent goals that they're willing to do what it takes to make it happen. And so this isn't the kind of endeavor in which some few reform champions are going to make a long-term difference, unfortunately. And I do think, reform champions are going to make a difference potentially in the long run by creating the overall you gotta want. I think, for instance, Rukmini Banerjee's a huge hero of mine. I think her and Madhav Chalvin and their continued attempt to raise these issues in factually informed ways has been part of the shift that's happening in India on this topic. But it wasn't their individual interventions and project designs that were, proved by an RCT to be effective at raising learning outcomes that made the difference. It was their recognition that they needed to change the overall environment and the concern about these issues. Last interview, did I tell a story about Madhav and...
You told us the story about Chandrabhan and the village where they're talking about if there's a snake versus a teacher.
Snake. And Madhav should tell the story, but I'm going to tell it better than Madhav would. So maybe it'll be less true, but more to the point, which is after they had done the RCT, showing that this, Balsaki program of putting tutors in the schools really led to substantial gains in learning achievement and reading outcomes, he took it to the Secretary of Education, or the place in which they'd done the RCT. And he said, oh, by the way, I have the solution to your problem of low learning levels, or at least part of the solution. Look, we've got this powerful evidence that, this works to improve reading outcomes by putting these volunteer tutors and pulling the low learning kids out. The response of the Secretary of Education was, what do you think my job is? Like, why do you think that this is a solution to a problem I have? Look around my office. See these piles and piles of files that keep me busy 60 hours a week, and not one of these files is about a child not learning. I'm under no pressure about that problem. If I try and transfer a teacher, I've got a court case on my hand. If I try and close a school, I got a court case on my hand. My job is to administer the existing education policy such that there's policy compliance, full stop. So super kudos to you for this cute little study you've done. It has nothing to do with my job as Secretary of Education. That is what led Madhav to realize that the problem wasn't rigorous knowledge about what works. The problem was getting anybody to care about the problem. And hence ASER and the kind of advocacy of getting people aware of and concerned about the low levels of learning was an instrument to get people to adopt the effective thing. So again, back to the RCT thing, the idea that it was the RCT that convinced people to have uptake of this improved innovation would have assumed that people in the system were out there looking for more effective ways to achieve an already shared and consensus target, and which was already a strong purpose of the system. Until you change the agreed upon purpose and understanding of the purpose of the system, all of that would have had zero impact. So what's changed India is not the RCT about Balsaki, it's the changed advocacy environment, making people aware of and concerned about, which has taken, 15 years to really get the momentum it needs. It's not like you drop in and go, oh, well, by the way, you needed this kind of fertilizer on your crops. And
it's a little bit heartbreaking because what's happening with poorer parents is they spend a very large proportion of their disposable income, exiting their kids from free public schools to, these budget private schools where the education's not great, but it's still better than the free public school. And I mean, what can be more damning than the evidence than the fact that, very poor parents are actually spending half their monthly income on, pulling their kids out of these schools. But one thing that worries me about education, which is different from other kinds of welfare programs, if you think at a political economy level is, if you think about sort of exit, voice, loyalty sort of frameworks, the mechanism has been exit. And it's understandable because voice and loyalty, the opportunity cost is just too high, right? A parent can't stand and advocate for their child for years on end where their child can't learn how to read and write or basic numeracy. So the best way to deal with it is just to pull their kids out of school and send them to an okay school, not that much better, than the one they're already at, just marginally better. So they're not going to have a dramatically better life, but they'll be somewhat better off. But what that ends up doing in the larger scheme of things is the only people advocating in front of the Secretary of Education or the Minister of Education are school teachers' unions and, people who are getting construction tenders for building new schools and stuff like that. It's not really the people who are using the services. So unlike healthcare or unlike, Gram Panchayat, there's so many other government programs where the voice, and loyalty overpower the exit. But in education, that doesn't seem to be the case. What's a good way to fix this?
That characterization of health, there's also been massive exit in health. I mean, if you look at Jishnu Das and others, they did a study of first to contact. So who do people, when they have a health condition, who's the first point of contact? And maybe, there were a lot of things about that study about the quality of care. But the really, in some sense, impressive thing was that of first care contact, the doctor at the PHC, 3%. Sometimes when I say describe India's healthcare system, people describe this kind of top-down chain of suppliers, but 3% of first care contact was an MBBS doctor. So it's not the system. The system is this huge, and I think there's been massive exit from that too. But I think this is maybe the deep problem about state capability in India is that, and Arvind Subramanian just had a kind of interesting interview in which he was pointing out that what the government's done is not try and fix the hard implementation things like health and education. They've improved the direct targetable, here you're getting gas, here you're getting concrete benefits of cash or in-kind transfers that are logistically simple. And that, again, it's not going to recreate a coalition about fixing the kind of core problems of the Indian state.
I call it the upside down Indian state, right? They don't provide public goods and quasi-public goods, but what they provide is private transfers and private entitlements, which could be done very well by the private sector, except now it's the government and the business. It's a little bit upside down if we think of it from a development point of view. It might still be better than nothing, but...
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of worrisome if you providing subsidized gas, but you don't have a police force.
But that's exactly the situation.
I know, and that's what I'm saying. That is an upside down. If you think of what functions are core to the state, a lot of the functions that are core to the state are being allowed to deteriorate over time, or at least stagnate over time, versus attention to providing what are just purely private goods, like purely private goods in a redistributive way, which, I'm not super against in some sense, but on the other hand, the idea that using high tech to identify individuals to make sure that people are getting the right this or that private good as a redistributive thing is a reform of the state. And that's your main improvement. That's a very twisted notion of what the fundamental responsibilities and capabilities of advanced developed states need to be. And I do think the exit problem is a very, very serious problem, because once you've exited, that often constitutes investments in another modality. My friend Junaid Ahmed, who was head of the World Bank office and has been in and out of India for the last 20 years, his big sector was, urban water. And he was, why do Indian cities not have 24/7 water? Then wanted to reform and municipal and corporatize and da-da-da. And it was like, I always just say to Junaid, everybody who really is politically powerful does have 24/7 water. And the way they've created 24/7 water is to put a tank on the top of their house that is filled by the public water when it's available, filled by a private tanker when it's not. And once they've made the capital investment in a purely privatized system of providing 24/7 water to them, getting them to exercise voice and loyalty in a system in order to have a municipal provide reliable 24/7 water universally just isn't on their agenda. And moreover, it's like, well, wait a second. Once I've made this capital investment in a public sector capability substituting investment, until that investment's amortized, it doesn't benefit me in the short run.
Alex Tabarrok and I had a paper on Gurgaon as India's first private city. And what we meant was that, it obviously grew awfully quickly. And there were huge gaps in public sector provisioning. So as economists, one way to think about this is great. The private sector stepped in everything from law and order. Gurgaon had the first private fire brigade and, like DLF. I went and spoke to the fire brigade, like the top people there. And I don't know how much Hindi you understand. One of the things he said was, we have no competition. The government municipality fire station, they were fighting with pichkaris, which means water pistols. Whereas, we actually have high-rise buildings. So we need a state-of-the-art equipment to actually protect our investment. So on the one hand, the private sector did step in. But on the other hand, you had all these problems of the commons, right? Which is groundwater depletion. And it's massively inefficient for each condo building to generate its own electricity or generate its own water. And, all these problems. So India's like sort of functioning in this complete exit and quasi-private, for the rich state, which creates much bigger problems because there's no real pressure from the bottom for governance amongst the most privileged class, right? So that's always a problem. Before we end, I wanted to ask you, what is the role of an economist? Is the role of an economist to be primarily, preachers, the way George Stigler meant it, right? So as persuading other people to adopt these goals that, maximize efficiency and a particular kind of outcome, is it to just be, academics and truth seekers? Is it to measure? Is it to model? What's the role of an economist?
I'm not quite sure what George Stigler meant by being a preacher, but the thing I like most about the field of economics is that it is still mostly people who are open to empirically grounded discussions of problems in which you'll acknowledge what the facts are and alternative approaches to, modalities of making the facts different. So, and then the other thing is what you said in the last interview is that the other is that I don't really teach undergraduates very often. I was invited to give the opening lecture to a development economics course of undergraduates. And my take was that economics is the social science of love. It's the truly loving social science. And they were, of course, like, what? Economics and love? Like, that's crazy. But think about what economists do is we take individuals' objective function as our objective function. We don't start with any premise about what would be good for society or good for X or good for Y. But I think economists, when they're doing it right, they start from what is it that people want to accomplish with their lives? Okay, let's think about what the actual outcomes are. And let's think about modalities at the society, political, market level that would facilitate individuals achieving their objectives more or less. And like, what could be a better description of love than I'm going to take what you want as what I want for you, and I'm going to help you achieve that. Like, so I think economics is the social science. It's the loving social science is my take on what economists do best.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, it's certainly been true for me. I always say that once you see the world as an economist, it's very difficult to see it in any other way. And it's quite wonderful. So last time I was asking you, what are you binge watching? This time I want to ask you, what are you reading?
Embarrassingly enough, I'm reading a David Baldacci novel, which it's just awful. So I'm reading that. And in part, I'm reading that because I'm also reading Noise, which I highly recommend. I thought, wow, here's some people talking about what I kind of do for a living, like how econometrics works. And I'm not insulted by it. That's impressive. It's a good book. I'm enjoying it. And then I was reading David Graeber and somebody else's History of Everything book. Have you seen this?
Oh, yeah.
And that, I had to read David Baldacci to like just contain my ire of that. It's completely, totally insane. So I would recommend that everyone read it. And then afterwards, we can have a discussion of like, really? Like, what have we come to in which this is regarded as an advance in the field of social science?
So what are your reading habits like? How do you pick what to read? I mean, I can see that you're trying to trade off between irritation and some kind of mindless pleasure at the moment. But more generally, what are your reading habits? Also, what's your split between reading papers and books? This is a question I like to ask economists.
So one of the problems with being my age and position is that I have to read a lot of stuff for a review, comment, So most of my reading is dictated by my having agreed to be on this committee or a peer reviewer of that or a referee of that other, or the research project I'm the research director has produced 158 or 159 working papers. I read every one of them or nearly all of them in a review stage. So anyway, so a lot of my reading is determined and therefore is mostly papers. And to the extent I read books, I often read books well before, I'm much more likely to read a manuscript of a book than a book. I was one time talking to somebody about, oh yeah, in this book, they do this and that. And they were like, I just read that book and they don't do what you're saying. And like, oh shoot, well, I read the manuscript like 2.5 years ago. So they were doing that. I could never have time to actually read the published version. So I read Chris Blattman's excellent new book in manuscript. And I read most of Bill Easterly's books in manuscript and stuff. So most of my reading is dictated by professional obligations. And so often when I, go to read at night, I can't read at night before I go to bed. I can't read professional stuff because I get irritated. It's not that I stay up reading it. I read something and then I get obsessed with why it's wrong. And then I spend the first hour I'm supposed to be sleeping composing an essay or a blog on why it's wrong. And I'm like, just go to sleep. So I can never read professional stuff after 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Then I have to binge watch something. That's why I binge watch rather than binge read. Because if I read something professional after 8 o'clock, it's like eating pizza just before bedtime. My mental indigestion can't handle it.
And what are some of your favorite economics books that you've read, like over the years? Need not be anything contemporary or something you read at manuscript stage. Could be one of the greats.
It depends on what you count as economics, I guess.
Whatever you count as economics is good enough for me.
James Scott's Seeing Like a State is a great
yes.
book. It's a great book. It's like I was reading, I think I said this before, I was reading and like, how has he been in the World Bank meetings I've been in? How does he know this is exactly how my organization works, right? So that was a great book. I actually read, and it's hard to not talk about what you're reading and not sound snobby, but I actually read Schumpeter's History of Economic Analysis, 600-page.
Yeah, another great book.
And I read a lot of it in part just because I enjoyed how incredibly snotty Schumpeter was. And I came away with like great lines that I can't find again since I read it on paper. Anyway, so I really enjoyed that because I enjoyed the appreciation. I think anybody who's really into a field appreciates the giants that came before and the evolution. So I really enjoyed history of economic analysis and came away with two things that I use all the time, one of which was Schumpeter describing an economist as having constructed a simple model that didn't work to explain the world. And rather than concluding correctly, I am a fool, they concluded the world is mad. And it's like, look, when the world doesn't conform to your model, the solution is not to conclude that the world is mad. The solution is that maybe my model or maybe my understanding needs to be deepened. And the second thing, which, by the way, is from Schumpeter, is what he calls the Ricardian vice, which is having understanding of a narrow little aspect of a phenomenon and then insisting that that understanding is what should be driving the discourse. And, to a very large extent, coming back to my bête noire, the RCT movement is completely Ricardian vice. We have this one little tool, this one little thing that augments our understanding of certain dimensions of certain things. And because we have that should dominate the public discourse. So I think the Ricardian vice is alive and well.
The first part that you mentioned, are you foolish or is the world wrong? I think you just described all of behavioral economics in one sense, right? I don't know if you meant to.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing how behavioral economics has made an entire field of calling the real world not good enough because it doesn't live up to the models of Homo economicus, whether it is savings rates or whatever is the question that is being asked, or, whether we're eating too much or eating too little. But thank you so much for doing this. This was such a pleasure.
I'm always happy to talk about India, always happy to talk about economics, and always happy to talk with an interviewer, an interlocutor who's so well informed. So pleasure is mine.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.